I'm Jim Check. You're watching Kelowna Now. With me, Gavin Dew, MLA for Kelowna Mission. Lots to talk about. Let's start off with a bridge. Like you guys have been asking for a bridge, and then we just had that incident here, which made for, I think, a lot of people say, like, why isn't there a second crossing?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously start by acknowledging it was a very complicated, tragic situation. By all indications, this was an individual who had some mental health struggles that were known, and I think there is obviously a really important mental health conversation around making sure that we're identifying these kinds of risks and keeping people safe. So that's an important conversation that we have to treat with compassion. But I think it also, yesterday showed us just how fragile and brittle our transportation corridor is when it comes to any kind of disruption. You had obviously the massive commuter traffic disruption, goods movement disruption, emergency response was a major challenge. Airport access. You had people getting stuck on forest roads. It demonstrated, I think, very clearly the need for us to get moving on not just a second crossing, which ends up being the really big thing that people talk about, but also on making sure that we're investing substantially in that entire transportation corridor. I think one of the things, we talked about a second crossing during the election, and elections tend to distill things down to, one simple idea. The reality is we believe we need a second crossing, but it has to be approached with an overall, stepwise set of solutions to that entire corridor. If you look at the Port Mann Highway 1 project, as an example, down in the Surrey Lower Mainland area, what was key about that project is it wasn't just a bridge. It was a bridge and 37 kilometers of highway improvements on either side of the bridge. So we need to get moving and plan that soon, and we need to get shovels in the ground sooner than later, which is something I frankly don't expect this NDP government to do. But that kind of significant capital investment in the region is certainly something that we'll see under a Conservative government sooner than later.
I think we're doing a story right now about the Penticton mayors actually said the 201, which is what we've used as the one that people got stuck on, as an alternative route, which is kind of, I don't know if you've ever been on the 201. Yep. I've been on it a few times, and it's pretty windy as you're coming out of Penticton there, for sure. Lots of switchbacks and not easy to navigate, but you're not getting transport trucks on there en masse for sure, up and down that 201. So there needs to be some type of thing. We've seen that with Summerland too, which you guys were out there today. Like that, when that road got closed, there has to be some alternatives in a industrialized country such as Canada. China, they can build whole cities in 10 years, like massive cities that can, like rival any Canadian city, and they do that in 10 years. Well, and we're having, spending how much time even messing with that Summerland thing there?
Well, look, the time and the money and the inability to get things done is, I think, what frustrates a lot of people. What I've written about this at length. I've talked about a crisis of indecision that I think we face in Canada and in BC in particular. And I would say that's twofold. Partly, it's that we are just so darn slow to get publicly funded transportation infrastructure, hospitals, schools, to get all those things built. And we're also so incredibly slow, and we create so much risk and uncertainty around building things in the private sector that we end up driving up the cost. We end up reducing the number of investments that get made in our province and in our country. And as a result, we actually diminish our own fiscal and economic health that would allow us to invest in getting that public sector infrastructure built faster. So we have to break that impasse and start, pardon my French, but we have to start getting shit done again in this country and in this province.
I would point people to, and this is the federal responsibility, our Trans-Canada Highway, our number one highway across Canada, is still not 4-lane all the way across Canada.
Yeah.
I mean, this country has been a nation for a while. And you know what I mean? Like, again, China can build, I think they just launched a 450 kilometer an hour train. And we don't have a Trans-Canada Highway that's 4-lane. How many people have lost their lives in that section between, like a Revelstoke to Calgary?
Look, we have the inability to get things done. Again, we make it too complicated and too expensive. An example that I often provide is the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, the pipeline. That original pipeline was built in 1952. It was a nation-building project that was brought to fruition in, call it 18 months, and it cost $93 million with the technology of 1952. That's $1 billion in today's dollars. When they went and they expanded, doubled that pipeline down functionally the same route, it cost $34 billion. Yeah. That's insane, right? And the result of that is when it costs so incredibly much to get anything built in this country and in this province, people don't invest. They don't build things. And with a project like that, okay, it finally got built, but the tolls that are now being charged on that pipeline are so substantial that they're actually eating away at the price spread that it was brought in to close. So on an everyday basis, less money is going back into the economy because of how overpriced that infrastructure asset became.
Yeah, so you talk about the pipelines, and then one of the things that the current government, I'm talking provincial and federal, has done is kind of suppress our natural resources. We've seen that in our even in our forestry sector, is we don't have access to other markets. Right now, we're at the mercy of the new administration in the United States, Donald Trump, who's said that he's going to launch tariffs if we don't tighten our border and do our NATO spending and all those things, and then we don't have a clear leadership response because we also have some turmoil at the federal level. But then we've had a lot of the provincial premiers getting involved, including Danielle Smith, and then David Eby just recently, he's lobbed some kind of some things that don't even make a lot of sense about charging people to drive to Alaska, and then recently,
bourbon and oranges.
Yeah.
So it's just this ridiculous thing. And I think you touched on the fact that we don't have a lot of access to other markets, and that is in part because we've willfully crippled our access to other markets. When you look at pipelines as an example, there's 810 or 820,000 kilometers of pipelines in Canada, and they're all integrated on a very north-south basis. They integrate with the American pipeline system. When you had people coming out and saying, "Hey, we're going to prevent oil from going to the U.S." Well, the reality is, in many instances, it crosses the border numerous times to make it
back into Canada. Yeah.
So, we had Energy East get blocked as a result of political intransigence in Quebec. We had pipeline access to the West Coast to allow Tidewater access and to close the price spread between West Coast Select and West Texas Intermediate oil, which would have which has brought significant new revenue into the Canadian economy. But we had to fight tooth and nail just to be able to build critical infrastructure to enable us to diversify our economy and to not be, as we are today, at the mercy of the United States. So when you combine the fact that we've made historical decisions over a matter of decades that have in some cases increased our reliance on that market, with the fact that this is a provincial government and a federal government as well that have left us with a stalled out, anemic economy with very little capacity and resilience to respond to even a minor economic threat, and now we're facing the big one. To me, that's just so insanely irresponsible, and it speaks to the total lack of economic competency and leadership on the part of both David Eby and Justin Trudeau.
So the one that really puzzles me is they say, Eby's come out and said that, Premier Eby's come out and said that we're going to do pandemic level spending until we can find access to other markets. These types of things, access to other markets, are infrastructure type projects that could take, with what we've done with Site C Dam, will take 10 years or so to build out. British Columbia plays a key role in Canada. We're one of the major ports, right? We have the access to the eastern market, right? But how do we can't get this done in 6 months, a year? What we got ourselves in with this pandemic level spending is the mess we find ourselves in today. And with all the regulations and the suppression of our natural resources, how do we find access to other markets? Would the Conservatives have a plan, I guess, is my question to you?
Yeah, I mean, Jim, first off, on just the COVID level spending that David Eby wants to push alongside Justin Trudeau, to me, that's just a wholly irresponsible response, right? We all saw what happened. The huge inflationary pressures that were created by that level of spending has led us into obviously massive inflation, into massive interest rate hikes. This
time it would lead to the destruction of the dollar. I guarantee that it would lead to the destruction of the Canadian dollar, and then you'll see inflation.
I don't see a lot of public appetite for the kind of COVID level spending and COVID level measures that David Eby wants to push through. But even when you see this premier try to pivot to the economy, which he's tried to do, we put a shot over the premier's bow shortly after the election. We made it very clear that we were pivoting hard toward a focus on private sector jobs and economic growth. And between that and the threat of tariffs, this premier has now decided that after years of ignoring the very existence of the economy, he's going to be the savior of the economy. And he started trying to speak about economic issues, started trying to position his government as one that is going to do the exact opposite of what it's been doing for the entirety of his time as premier. So, they came out and announced that they were going to, for example, waive the environmental assessment process for a set of wind power projects, which is interesting because that is basically an admission on the part of government that their EA process is not working and is blocking projects. But instead of fixing the process, they're going to carve out their political priority. That speaks to just how unserious this government is. They're going through considerable changes to the Mineral Tenures Act, which affects staking in the mining sector. And on the one hand, you've got a government trying to establish trust with a mining sector who are very dubious, and then you've got the minister responsible for economic development, for jobs, for red tape reduction, which is my critic portfolio, coming out and basically endorsing this study that came out of Simon Fraser University that said red tape's not the problem. And again, this minister, who should be the one person who gets it, that we need to address the issue of red tape and permitting, continues to deliver that same message that, red tape's not the problem. Government's not the problem. It's something else. So this is a government that I think is trying desperately to at least pay lip service to the need to pivot toward the economy. But fundamentally, these folks don't understand a thing about business.
So a lot of people are saying that there's a lot of noise out there saying that we need leadership to deal with the tariffs and deal with Donald Trump. But right now we have a resigned prime minister and we have a leadership race in the Liberal Party. How much pressure can the premiers put on the federal government to force an election?
I think the premiers have been left to fill the void.
Right.
In the absence
but it's a disjointed filling, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. What you need is actually a level of cohesion and unity around a core message. And for that, you actually need to have a functioning leader. I think, Donald Trump smells weakness, and there's a whole heck of a lot of weakness going on in Canada right now. You obviously have a prime minister who's been a lame duck for some time, who has absolutely no mandate to negotiate anything with anyone whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So, Trump is going to take advantage of that weakness and of that drift in terms of a national agenda. I think that it is incredibly selfish, frankly, for the Liberal Party of Canada to expect Canadians to wait while they sort themselves out, as Pierre Poilievre put it, and to basically put us all in a position where we are weak in our response to an existential economic threat, where we are attempting to negotiate with our greatest trading partner, and we don't even have a negotiator with a mandate at the table. So I do think pressure can be brought to bear to get an election going sooner, and I do think that it definitely needs to be, and I do think that, frankly, history will remember this moment and will remember the level of political selfishness that was shown.
So we see in Alberta, Danielle Smith ran on Alberta First. That was her mandate. She ran on Alberta First, and she was elected on an Alberta First mandate. I mean, she was clear about that. That's how she ran, right? Alberta First. Albertans come first. Donald Trump ran on the same thing, and he got a mandate from the American people. It's America First. Do you think the current government in British Columbia, I won't get you involved in the federal stuff because this is your thing, do you think we've had a British Columbia First mandate?
No. Yeah. No, I don't think. I think this government, frankly, has lost direction. I think they don't know what they want to do. I think that they were in a very lucky position where until shortly before this election, they had a divided opposition. And they thought they didn't need to worry about having a clear plan. They thought they didn't need to worry about any of that stuff because they were going to have a cakewalk to a supermajority. Then all of a sudden, they found themselves in a hard-fought election. And instead of articulating any kind of a positive vision that would put BC first, any kind of an economic vision, any kind of a strategy or plan, they spent all of their time trying to denigrate and marginalize their conservative opponents. Now they find themselves in a position where they've barely hung on to government. They've realized they're actually facing a serious opposition that it's putting its focus on jobs and the economy and on substantive policy issues. And I think that they are just not prepared. So that's why they've waited so long to call the legislature.
There's a bunch of, politicians out there calling for a Canada First kind of like reaction to this. Is the NDP reaching across the aisle and saying, "Hey, do you got some ideas that we can put forth together to the Conservatives"? Are they trying to work with you?
No.
So I mean, if you're calling for a Canada, like Team Canada, you're the opposition. Shouldn't all ideas be put on the table and just like, what can we do here? How do we get out of this?
You would think so, Jim. But look, what Premier Eby has done is he's put together, his response to this tariff threat is, COVID style spending. It's silly posturing about bourbon and oranges, and now he's put together, wait for it, a committee. He's put together a cabinet committee.
The dreaded committees.
Now, the dreaded committees are long, dark cul-de-sacs down which good ideas are sent to be strangled. But he's put together a committee where he's got this, frankly, very weak economic cabinet where he's got, a finance minister who was promoted to finance after creating 0 private sector jobs when she was jobs minister. He's got a jobs minister who doesn't believe that red tape is a problem. He's got an agriculture minister who spent 5 years fighting against John Horgan's commitment to enable processing on farm. He's got a forestry minister who's never cut down a tree or held a job in the private sector as far as I'm aware of. And it's led by Ravi Kahlon, who led the government's last whole of government push on housing. And guess what? Last year, housing starts went down by 5,000. So he's got just, frankly, a weak team, no plan, and a very weak mandate from the people of British Columbia. And as I said online earlier today, I think the best support package that David Eby could give would be an envelope containing his resignation letter.
How many plane tickets have they bought right now to send somebody to Japan, send somebody to, different markets in the world, to Europe, to different places to say, will you buy our lumber? Will you buy our oil and gas? Will you buy our whatever it is that we're going to subsidize? What are we doing to develop markets outside of the United States?
Well, Jim, the funny thing is that this NDP government actually shut down trade offices that BC had all over the world and basically tried to embed in federal offices where we're paying some salaries in some federal offices that are not focused on BC. So literally, as we've led up to this crisis, you have a government that has reduced our ability to increase our trade in the world, that has delayed and driven up the cost of our trade-enabling infrastructure to get our goods to market, that has driven a generation of young entrepreneurs and innovators out of this province, and that has left us with a private sector economy in tatters, very little response capacity in order to pivot in this situation. And on top of all of that, they've massively bloated the size of the public sector payroll. So we're going to be paying for that with a diminished economy.
Perhaps one of the ideas, this is a joke, that maybe David Eby should just, instead of like giving, like a CERB type thing out, just hire everybody for the government. Everybody works for the government. Everybody works for the government, and everybody gets a minister's position.
To be honest, I mean, the only people that have actually been looked out for by David Eby is his cabinet, who gave a $1.9 million a year raise to before sending them off on vacation. We actually just got access to all of the cabinet ministers' calendars, which they're obliged to disclose. They've had, from what I saw, one cabinet meeting since the election. A number of their cabinet ministers have had no meetings or have broken the law or broken the rules by refusing to disclose what meetings they're having. So you have basically a non-functioning government that are getting paid a bunch of money. And at the same time, to your point, look, this is a government that over the last 7 years pre-election had 0% private sector job growth and 33% public sector job growth. And there are people, and I've had them take runs at me online, there are people in that party who fundamentally believe that the only good jobs are public sector jobs. And don't get me wrong, Jim, we need strong public services, but we also need a private sector to pay for it, and that is what this economically illiterate government does not understand.
One of our biggest contributions to our GDP in British Columbia is our forestry sector, which, Kevin Falcon, when he was still running as the opposition leader, and John Rustad, your leader, has said that it's in shambles and tragic. And what have we done to convince the Canforest to come back and invest when they left, like the AP planers and those guys? Because that is one of our biggest resources. Because you look at British Columbia, if you look at it from a Google's map, what do you see? Trees, right? Tons and tons of trees, one of our greatest assets. And how are we developing those markets? Because I'm pretty sure that if tariffs come with already the softwood lumber stuff, that's going to hit the forestry industry the hardest.
Yeah, I think, look, I was speaking with a forestry executive recently, and the way that they put it is that this government has created so much instability that it is basically uninvestable. And there is no question that people are simply pulling capital and waiting until they actually have clarity on being
That was
able
even
to
prior
invest.
to these tariffs. Canfor
Absolutely.
closed the planned expansion in Houston, closed Bear Lake, and cut back in Prince George.
Yeah, but look, brass tacks, when it comes to trying to address the forestry sector, we have a forest minister who's never cut down a tree in his life and has only ever worked in government. On the other hand, we have a forest critic in Ward Stamer who spent 40 years working in the forestry sector and knows it like the back of his hand. So, to me, what that hopefully should signal to people as we get down to our job of being a strong opposition is we want to make sure that we are developing a government in waiting that knows the files, that has a clear, coherent plan for what we'll do as a government, so that when we are able to defeat the NDP and form a new government, we won't be going around in circles for a year or two trying to figure out what to do, as these guys have been doing. We'll be going in and getting the job done.
We used to be pretty good partners with Alberta, and Alberta's got the excuse me there, the trump card though, because a lot of the exports are Alberta oil and gas. How is our relationship with Alberta? Excuse me.
Not great.
Yeah.
The reality
Used
is,
to be good.
yeah, absolutely. Look, we should be thinking from a very Western Canadian perspective. And I think Kelowna is actually uniquely positioned at kind of a cultural crossroads between BC and Alberta. We've got a lot of folks that live here and do a ton of
Kelowna,
business
Calgary
in
has a
Alberta.
huge connection.
100%, right? There's such a massive opportunity there for us specifically. But what I will say is when you cross the border into Alberta, the air is just different. There is a can-do attitude. There's a desire to see investment. Obviously housing is less expensive. Taxes are lower. I genuinely worry at the number of people that we are losing to Alberta. And I really do think we have to get back on track, both from a policy perspective, but also a political and cultural perspective, so that we don't lose a generation of smart young people who could be successful anywhere. Because we're losing just so much investment, so much opportunity. We have the fundamentals. You want to talk about oil and gas? We've got tons of natural gas here, and we're not exploiting it enough. We've got tons and tons and tons
They
of
were here
opportunities
begging
for mining
for it.
critical minerals.
The Japanese were here begging for it. The Germans were here begging for it. And our federal government told them that there's no viable plan for that, but they'll sell them hydrogen in the future, which we don't have. Right.
Yeah, I mean, look, Jim, our economy in BC is weak by choice. By choices that have been made by governments, by political choices that have been made. We have cut our own throat, and we have put ourselves in a position where we are not only are we not making the most of the endowment that we have of resources and people, but we have left ourselves so unprepared for the economic crisis that we face right now as a result of these tariffs.
So is there a conservative responsibility, instead of just being opposition, to say, hey, these are the plans, and even if it makes it look like EB gets a win out of it, where we kind of say, Daniel Smith seems to be the only one operating with a cool head and said, let's negotiate instead of throwing barbs. So we seem to be throwing barbs across the fence, because Trump is really good at that stuff, and it's so easy to react, right? So. But a calmer response might be better when you're dealing with a bully of that nature.
Yeah, I think if there's opportunities to work together, substantively in a real way, obviously that's something that we'd look to take up. But I think the reality is when you look at the kind of rhetoric that David Eby is using, it is transparently clear that what he is hoping to do is a couple things. Number one, he wants to be seen to be in a fight with Donald Trump because he believes that will consolidate center-left and centrist voters under his voter coalition for political gain. So that's what he's doing. He's playing politics because he would rather be in a fight with Donald Trump than face his own opposition in his own legislature. And the second thing that it is transparently evident he's trying to do is he's going to try to blame the economic devastation that he has brought to this province on Trump and tariffs. When the reality is that I would argue that David Eby and his failed policies are actually a bigger threat to our economy than Donald Trump and his tariffs.
I think the big question mark on many Canadians should be, we need to take a look in the mirror and accept some responsibility for how we're here, because we don't have other developed markets, and we put ourselves at risk, just like any company. If you're so reliant on one client and that one client leaves and your company's done, this is where we're at right now. We're so reliant on the Americans for everything, for NATO as well. You know what I mean? We're relying on them to be under their protection. We're relying on them for the the trade we do with them. We haven't kept up with our NATO spending. We haven't, like developed other markets. So we have to assume some of that responsibility ourselves. Even every voter has to accept some of that responsibility because we've been negligent in how we operate our country.
Sure, Jim. And I think, when it comes to responsibility, one of the areas that there's been a lot of debate around is, the claim by President Trump around, border security and particular, drugs. So I find it absolutely insane that there are people who, because they don't like President Trump or his tone, want to deny the reality that we have porous ports through which drugs and drug precursors are coming into our country or leaving.
Some of the most
country.
lax drug policies in the world.
Exactly.
Never mind Canada,
exactly.
Right?
To me, the metaphor is like your home is on fire and your neighbor is screaming fire, but you don't like your neighbor, so you don't want to put out the fire. The reality is we have serious issues in terms of drug smuggling through our ports. This is very real. We've had an inadequate policing response. We have an inadequate amount of screening at the border, and we are a very, very porous destination for drugs, for fentanyl precursors to come in, for stolen goods to go out. We do need to actually address that issue, and just because it's Donald Trump flagging it doesn't mean we shouldn't get really, really serious about a substantive response to the thing he says he wants to see Canada respond to. You tell me, how do we lose out as a country and as a province if we do a better job of securing our ports?
Yeah, common sense says that we should be securing our ports and we should be securing our borders. And we should deal with this drug crisis. Even like in Falkland, we had that big bust. I mean, it's evident that BC is being used as a place to make this stuff. I mean,
well,
we've
made it very easy to come in, and frankly, we've created a wild market for drugs. We've got to seriously rethink that approach.
We'll talk about some lighter stuff. And just maybe I'd get your thoughts on Sonia Furstenau step down. Any thoughts on that?
I would say start the countdown clock until she becomes a federal NDP candidate.
Well, there you go.
Or gets appointed to a well-paid board by the BC NDP as a thank you for her services over the years. I mean, I think look, I don't know Sonia well. I've met her. I like her. We get along. But I do think it's a fair statement that it was Sonia's objection that made it impossible for Andrew Weaver to negotiate effectively in 2017 when they found themselves in the CASA with the NDP. The conflict supply agreement.
Well. Yeah.
There was a real disconnect there, and Sonia was very, very opposed to any right of center party. And I would say in this instance, the possibility of negotiation between the Conservative Party of BC and the Greens was in all likelihood foreclosed because Sonia had such a dominant grip over the direction of the party. So now what remains to be seen is whether and how the Greens can assert relevance. It appears as if neither of the two MLAs are interested in pursuing the leadership of the party, so that will leave a bit of a sort of strange gap there as they try to get their feet under them in the legislature without really having a leader. So I would say, maybe.
Well, John's good on the phone. He convinces people to walk across. That's a joke.
Come on over, guys.
Yeah, I lost my last question. EV mandates. They dropped them in the US. The credits are likely gone. Automakers now in Canada are saying, Stellantis already left now. Automakers in Canada say they're not going to be able to compete if there's EV mandates here, and they'll likely pull auto manufacturing out of Canada. BC still has EV mandates and also still has a credit, although it's been really toned down and feds that don't have a credit anymore. What's your thoughts on these EV mandates in the auto industry?
There's a lot of complexity to the mandate side, the subsidy side, all those different pieces. I would say, when you're seeing more and more market uptake of a product, the extent to which you need to subsidize it, I think needs to start, eventually dialing back. I would say we have to actually have what ends up happening is that, EV mandates end up becoming sort of a battleground in the culture war rather than a substantive policy conversation. Yeah. And that's where, as an example, I thought one of the most inexpensive ways to induce demand for electric vehicles in BC was actually, the HOV sticker that you could put on the back of your car and be able to drive in an HOV lane. Now, on the one hand, that was a very, very, economically, fiscally prudent way of incentivizing demand. On the other hand, now as you're getting more and more uptake, how long can that policy last? And equally importantly, how do you deal with challenges where, for example, in a good chunk of the province, you've got gas tax paying for transit and for road maintenance. Now, if you're driving an EV, you're basically getting carved out of paying for the maintenance of the roads you're driving on. So there's going to have to be some really serious, not just ideological conversations, but really serious policy conversations around the future of EVs in
Well,
BC.
according to the federal environment minister, he doesn't want to put any money into roads, so you don't need that tax because there's no roads.
Well, thankfully, he's not going to be the environment minister for long, Jim.
Another joke. It's Comedy Central here today. Any final thoughts? Like you've been now an MP or MLA for, a while. Any surprises?
I mean, I think it's as expected. Like we're doing the work. I think I've been very active in the community, very active on the road, meeting with stakeholders, trying to be very prepared as we prepare to finally go into the legislature on February 18th. It's been a really...
You haven't been there yet, right?
No, it's absolutely
And
wild.
you've been elected when?
Yeah, since October. It's absolutely...
And you haven't been in the House yet?
It's just, it's honestly wild, Jim, just the total lack of accountability. Like this government does not want to get into the House. We've been existing in this strange phony war for months where we're sort of circling each other. Yeah. So I think everyone is excited about actually getting into the legislature, having direct accountability through question period, being able to, to actually debate substantive policy and bills. And I think that when we do that, we're going to demonstrate that we're a focused government in waiting that's talking about, the everyday concerns of British Columbians. And I think that's going to continue to diminish the ever wavering support for David Eby and his government, and hopefully get us to an election soon.
They promised $1,000 when they ran. They said they'd get that right away, and they delayed, so you can't even say no until February 18th. Right? But I don't think with all this going on that $1,000 is going anywhere.
Well, hey, what do you know? They're going to use Donald Trump as an excuse to break the promise, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, this is a government that had no plan, that was reliant on a vote split and then reliant on a culture war to win an election they had no business winning. This is a premier that has a very weak mandate from the public, a very weak mandate from his own party, and I don't think we'll make it until the next election. And, God willing, that next election will come in less than 4 years, and we'll be able to get focused on getting BC back on track.
So if you're waiting for that $250 check from the feds, likely not going to get that. And if you're waiting for that $1,000 check from the province, you're likely not to get that either. Building bridges, burning bridges. In the U.S., it seems like we've got some politicians that would like to burn a bridge, and then we're hopefully trying to build a bridge here, and that's how we'll end it, I guess.
Yeah, Jim, thanks so much for having me. And as you say, right, that's the most important thing. Look, politics can get spicy, and that's part of the job. But at the end of the day, what we do need to do is we need to build bridges in the community. We need to build bridges with trade partners, and we need to start getting stuff done in this province again. Yeah, building bridges to a better tomorrow would be a good plan, right? Absolutely. All right, thank you for coming in, and we do thank you for watching Kelowna Now. Thanks for having me, Jim.
We don't just report the news. We live here too.
Try to
We're
keep
your
it light,
neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us.
We're always a little
no
spicy,
government
Jim. We'll get
funding,
to that
no
one.
outside influence. Kelowna Now.